today, like I said, I'm going to move on to talk about the last thing, I guess, with Age of Absolutism, which is, of course, the rise of Russian absolutism. Of course, I'll concentrate more on the Romanov dynasty, of course, which is really the most famous dynasty that Russia had. It's one of its longest, I guess, in modern times. It's around over 300 years. Of course, famous for Czars like Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, which are both considered really to be the two most famous, I think, Czars that they really ever had. Anyway, we'll talk about, of course, Russia. Now, the Russian state goes back a while. That's one thing about Russia, maybe a little different from some of those states, maybe in Central Europe, like Prussia or Austria. But the Russian state itself goes all the way back, really, to like around the 10th century, like the 900s CE, in the Middle Ages. Russia was actually explored and settled by Viking people that came out of Scandinavia. Kind of the Viking age, if you go back to the Middle Ages, it kind of peaked around the 9th to about the 11th centuries. And so you had Vikings exploring all throughout Northern Europe, like from Britain, Northern France, Northern Germany, all the way into Russia, North Atlantic, even reaching, they think, the New World, like Leif Erikson, I guess, the Vinland, in Newfoundland, maybe, they think. But Russians eventually came eastward into Russia. Later, they created the so-called Kievan Rus, which was like a type of state that was there, like an early state. And but they weren't called the Rus. The term Rus was a term that evolved from the fact that the Vikings would row their Viking longships. And so the word Rus supposedly meant to row, like to row a ship, basically. But they actually were called Varangian, I think was the common name that they call a lot of the Vikings that came into Russia, I think maybe out of Sweden predominantly. They primarily developed in the Ukraine, like western part of Russia, and cities like Kiev, Novgorod, came kind of important in Russia. But Kiev was, I think they say, the capital of early Russia before Moscow or St. Petersburg, became important later. Kiev, of course, today, is the modern capital of Ukraine, which broke off from the Soviet Union. Looks like Sophie is also joining us this morning. So I hope you're having a great morning out there. Sorry, we kind of started late a little bit. Now, why did the Vikings come into Russia? What's the deal with that? Well, the Vikings were trying to reach either the Orient, like the Silk Road trade routes that are going through Asia, or reaching the Byzantine Empire, which was based around the Black Sea, in that area, like around Turkey and Greece. And so they came down all these rivers, like I've got there, some of the rivers anyway, the Don, the Dnieper, the Volga. Those are some rivers that they kind of sailed down into. They tried to reach the Black Sea, the Aral Sea. I believe I do have a map showing you some of the Vikings trying to get into Russia, which is right here. So you can see how right there, you can see how the Vikings kind of, from Norway, Sweden, and those areas, they tried to sail basically this way to reach, Constantinople, which is down here. And I guess all these different trade routes from the Silk Road coming east to west, going towards Constantinople. So you can see the Volga River over here, Dnieper, the Don. There's some other Niemen River up here, and Dvina River also over here. Some even went into northern Germany right here. I think they call them the Prus, I know, in northern Germany. And then a lot of the Slavic peoples that were there already called them the Rus. So hence the name kind of sticking. I think that's one of the early Vikings that come in. There's a lot of early Vikings that do come in that are famous. If you read about, there's one that they talk about all the time named Prince Rurik, who was, I think, considered like one of the first grand princes. They call it a grand prince or a grand duke that ruled over the Kievan Rus. I think Kiev and Novgorod, I think, were some of the early cities that they founded, mostly around the Ukraine. But Rurik was one of their first chieftains and basically the namesake of where the first Russian dynasty starts, so-called Rurik Dynasty, which will be around up to like the time of Ivan the Terrible, Ivan the Fourth. So it's a long, long dynasty that lasts several hundred years. That's in Russia. They had other famous Russian leaders. Oleg of Novgorod, who I think they founded that city up in the northwestern part of Russia. In fact, you can see it up here. Novgorod is an early city they founded. The Rus up here. You can see Kiev down here, right here as well. Askald and Dur, I think, were some early leaders. Olga of Kiev, you don't hear much about her. There was actually a female ruler who actually was kind of powerful somewhat. And then they always talk about Vladimir the Great. Of course, one of the most famous, of course, early Viking leaders they had. I'll kind of go back up to the slide right here. It's him on the bottom right here, Vladimir, who's now, by the way, a saint in the Orthodox Church in Russia. He's very important. He's kind of seen as one of Russia's important rulers, starting, they think, in the late 10th century, maybe close to about 988. He began to convert all the Russians to Christianity. And they had looked at other religions. They looked at Catholicism. They looked at Orthodox Christianity as part of the Byzantine Empire. I think they even looked at Judaism, believe it or not. They were trying to seek different religions out. And so they decided to convert to Orthodox Christianity because of the fact that a lot of the Byzantines had sent a lot of these priests up into, Russia to evangelize them. And you may have heard of, I think it was Cyril and I think Methodius, I think in the 9th century, were these Christian monks who were missionaries. And they kind of influenced Vladimir to eventually convert. They also think that the Byzantine Empire affected them not just religious-wise, but language-wise. A lot of the language of Russia, which is called Cyrillic, was influenced from Greek. A lot of the architecture in Russia, that background you're kind of looking at right here with St. Basil's Cathedral behind me, that onion dome shaped, buildings or whatever. That's something that, was an influence from basically the Byzantine Empire. They also wanted also Moscow. They kind of viewed Moscow as maybe this third Rome that would replace like Rome and Constantinople and all that. And so that was something that they kind of saw, with Russia. Now, I'll kind of talk about it next. There's another thing that happens in Russian history, which is kind of a bad thing, if you know about it. There's this, of course, famous incident that happens in the 13th century, which, of course, that is the so-called invasion, the so-called Mongol invasion, or Mongol invasion occurs in the early 13th century. And you get this deal where the Mongol Empire, spreads out from Mongolia, conquering China, conquering parts of, Asia, all the way to, they pushed pretty much through China, all the way into Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, pushing all the way to the Caspian and Black Seas. And then also, of course, pushing into, at one point, into Russia itself. This is all because of, Genghis Khan, who was the founder of the Mongol Empire in the early 13th century. Then his sons and grandsons kind of expanded it, broke it up, of course, later. There was this grandson of Genghis Khan named Batu Khan. He's one of the Mongols that actually invaded into Russia and formed this Mongol state that was called the Golden Horde Khanate, that they usually called it, and became this vassal state, which the Russians were under the Mongols, but they were actually ruled by these what they call Tatars, because as the Mongols pushed westward, they met the Turks, if you know about those Turkish peoples, and they kind of merged together as a culture. And so they hired a lot of these Turks as mercenaries, to control parts of their empire. And so in Russia, they called them Tatars, basically. Why was it called Golden Horde? There's different theories on it about that. But there was two theories that's popular. One is that a lot of the Tatars lived in these tents that were kind of goldish looking color. So the term Golden Horde was used. Of course, the term horde, was often used for the Mongols, who were sometimes called the devil's horsemen in Europe. So people thought the devil had sent them to conquer them. And then some people thought they were also called Golden Horde because the Russians were forced to pay like gold tribute toward the Mongols. Otherwise, they would come down and basically attack their cities. And apparently Kiev didn't want to pay, I think, some of the gold tribute. And so they came down and they burned their city down, I think more in the later 13th century. And so that's why Moscow became important later, because Kiev got destroyed and it was rebuilt later. Then after that, you get the next thing that happens in Russia. They have, of course, these the rise of the Czars that they have, of course, that come in later into Russia with the so-called Rurik Dynasty. You get these rulers that kind of act like they're more like kings, or the term Czar is more of a word from the word Caesar, from the Romans a long time ago. One of the first important Czars was Ivan III, who they later called the Great. And he's a very important Tsar because he's one of the first major rulers in Russia that basically reunites all the lands of Russia. I think they call it later the so-called Tsardom of Russia is the common term that they used. Here's, of course, a picture of him right here. He was also instrumental in pushing the Mongols out, which is true about that. And he also began to kind of renovate the actual Kremlin, which, later becomes like the headquarters or palace, basically. It's like really like a fortress, but basically it becomes the place where the czars rule from. Now it's like where the Russian White House basically is, where Vladimir Putin, of course, rules from. But, Ivan began to experiment with this idea of the title czar, which, of course, I told you evolved from the Romans, from the word Caesar, because he had married apparently one of the, I think he married one of the nieces of one of the last emperors of the Byzantine Empire. And so he got this idea of Moscow becoming a third Rome. So Kiev became less important. Moscow, of course, ends up being really used. But he did kind of experiment, like I said, with the title, but it was never an official title that was actually used. It's not going to be really used until Ivan IV comes along, which is his grandson. One thing that the Russians are famous for at that time, they start adopting the double-headed eagle. I think I'll show it. I think I've got maybe a picture of one later I'll show you. But the double-headed eagle is something that evolved from the Byzantine Empire. And of course, I've shown you that before, the double-headed eagle. I think many times we've viewed that overall, but that's been around. I think the Prussians used it. It's actually right here, this image right here, the double-headed eagle. But I think how it came about with the double-headed eagle is that basically the Byzantine Empire was the state that was based in Europe, like going west, and also in Asia going east, like in the Near East. So that was why it had the, basically the double head. So Russia was like that too. Russia was partially, in Europe, its eastern part in Asia. And so hence that being used. And later, the Romanov Dynasty uses it a lot, of course, when they, come to power. Now, then you got this other ruler that comes later, who I did want to talk about, which is, of course, Ivan IV. Of course, very famous ruler, come to power more into the 16th century. Of course, Ivan IV was known as the Terrible. He was the grandson of Ivan III the Great. They do consider him, by the way, to be one of the longest reigning rulers in Russian history. Actually reigned from 1533 to 1584. So that's like around 50 years that he was in power. He was also considered one of the most absolute rulers in Russian history overall. He actually is not crowned, though, until 1547. So he becomes Tsar, 1547. So that starts the so-called Russian Empire. The Russian Empire will start in 1547. Actually, I'm sorry, it's not right. 1547 to 1721, you have what they call the Tsardom of Russia. That was the actual official name they called it. Wasn't necessarily an empire officially at that point. So 1547 to 1721, it was considered just the Tsardom of Russia. And then Peter the Great changed the name, took the title Emperor of Russia, basically. And so from 1721 to 1917, you've got the Russian Empire. Oh, that follows. But it's becoming an empire because under Ivan, they start expanding eastward, like into Siberia and all that, and pushing toward the Pacific eventually. But about the name Ivan the Terrible, the name Terrible it actually went by the name Ivan Grozny, which Grozny in Russian means different translations. I got some up there, but it could mean basically like he's very fearsome person, very formidable, or even he's awesome in power. I guess would be the kind of name it means. You think of terrible as he's a terrible person, kind of was, sort of, but the name was like a type of name that was supposed to strike fear in people. People scared of him and things like that. And the Mongols, I think, made a joke about him later. And they said that when he was born with 2 teeth. One tooth to devour the Russian people and the other to devour the Mongols also as well. Now I'll talk about some of the things that he's very famous for. Of course, I just showed you that picture of I think it was St. Basil's Cathedral, which I had in the background with me, but there it is right there. That was a very famous, of course, today still is, of course, now it's a museum, but originally it was an Orthodox cathedral, of course, and that's in Red Square, which was completed in 1561. And it's known for its onion-shaped and, of course, multicolored domes to it, which were heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire and all that. And I suppose he built this cathedral to honor some of his military victories, especially in Siberia, because it's under Ivan the Terrible that Russia begins to push east of the Ural Mountains, where most of Russia is. A lot of Russia is more in the east than in the west. Very few people live in the east, which is weird about Russia. But yeah, he was one of the first czars to expand, into Siberia. And there were 2 areas he conquered the most, which was Kazan and Siber, which were areas that were ruled by the Mongols and the Tatars and all that. I think it was Kazan was the main one that he conquered, massacred a bunch of their people too. He conquered them. And so he built this cathedral in honor of that. He was, by the way, notorious for a lot of different things, which I did want to talk about, of course, with Ivan. Ivan was known for committing a lot of genocide on his own people. He had this special police force, like a secret police force, which, the Russians have been known for that. Like the Czars had their own police force later. I think it was called Okhrana or something like that. I know the Soviet Union had a secret police later, which had all kinds of names. NKVD, KGB, whatever. You've heard of those names probably before. He had one that was called the Oprichniki, which was this special secret police force that he basically amassed under his reign. And they were often, I think he had like 6,000 men that were in it. They had a nickname. They were called the Tsar's Dogs. The reason why they were called that was because they would actually ride around with this like a head of a dog on their horses. They dressed like monks. They're kind of a weird order. And he used them basically to, I guess, crack down on anybody that was against the regime. He saw enemies of the state everywhere. And there was an incident that happened in 1570, which was kind of famous, called the Novgorod Massacre. Novgorod, I told you, was up in the northwestern part of Russia, closer to Scandinavia. And this was all going on when wars were kind of being fought, I think, against like Poland and a few other states, like in Scandinavia. He had a lot of mistrust toward them, especially, I think, their local Orthodox church in Ukraine. And so Pricknick supposedly massacred thousands of people. I don't know if it's that many people, but I know the numbers are anywhere from 3,000 to 30,000. They don't really know for sure how many that he killed, but he was kind of known for that kind of thing. And even when he was a kid, you see there, he would torture animals and things like that. And so he was kind of seen as this man that was really unhinged almost, maybe somewhat. But he was a very absolute ruler, like one of the most absolute rulers probably of Russia ever. I think some people sometimes compare him with Stalin, like as being like the czar that's kind of close to Joseph Stalin or something like that in the Soviet Union. The Rurik Dynasty, by the way, declined. It kind of lasts up to like the late 16th century, going up to maybe about 1598, you can see there. It was caused by different things, but one of the main things that caused the decline was apparently he had this son who was the heir to the throne named Ivanovich. Now, notice he has a staff in his hand, Ivan. Well, apparently he had gotten some kind of disagreement with his son because he didn't like the way his son's wife was dressed. And so he hit him in the head with his staff. He didn't mean to kill him, but he killed him. That's what he did. And so after that, he didn't really have any sons that were any good. I think he had one son that was like mentally something wrong with him. And so after that, the dynasty basically faded out after that. So didn't really amount to anything much after that. And then Russia then went through a dark period in its history. They have this period that's called the Time of Troubles that follows 1598 to 1613, where there was a period of anarchy in the country. There was a guy named Boris Godunov, I think, that reigned briefly. He was a non-Rurik czar who was in power. I think I was the only one that maybe had any real power at all. And the nobility started to take over the country, like the boyars, as they're called in Russia at the time. And they decided to pick a new czar in power. And so they found this man named Michael Romanov, who was actually, I think he was actually a monk who was in the Orthodox Church, who was related through Ivan IV through his first wife, who was Anastasia Romanova. So he was a grandnephew. And so they brought him out. And so he founded the so-called Ramanath Dynasty, of course, in 1613. And that becomes one of Russia's most famous dynasties that reigns up to World War I, ending with Tsar Nicholas II. So they elect him to power pretty much after that. They call him Michael or Michael the First. I think usually that's what they called him. And then later they have another czar that comes in that was named Alexis the First, or Alexis Romanov, who comes in. He's the second Romanov czar, and he actually comes in and begins to really weaken the nobility and become more of an absolute ruler, even abolishing. They had this assembly of the boyars they kind of abolish it at that time. And so after that, the czars kind of gained more power, not just over the state, but even over the church, which they had control of also as well. So that moves into the main thing I wanted to talk about today, of course, which is, of course, getting to Peter the Great, who later comes in as czar. Peter the Great, of course, considered one of the greatest, rulers in Russian history. He's very important because not only did he make Russia into a world power, he also helped to modernize the state, because Russia at the time was really kind of still medieval, the medieval type state. Even in the 17th century at that time. And so he begins to kind of look at Europe, what's going on with the Enlightenment. I'll get to it later, even travels to Russia. He travels from Russia to the rest of Europe to see, what's going on in some of these countries. What can Russia do to better its military and things like that. And at first, he didn't reign, by the way, much. You know about early in his reign, I know 1682 to 89, he had this half-sister named Sophia, who actually controlled the throne. He actually co-ruled with his brother, half-brother, named Ivan V, who had some mental problems. And so she basically told them what to do. I think there was even a case where she built this special throne which had a hole in the middle, and she would just tell them what to say, like to the court or whatever. And so she was kind of the power behind the throne. But after Ivan died, Peter then eventually took over and got more power, eventually. So Peter actually reigns, like if you read about it, he doesn't really get sole power till later, but his reign is pretty long. He reigns, you can see, over 40 years, like 42, 43 years. It's about the reign of Peter the Great, but I don't think he really gets a lot of power till like the 1790s, like 96 is when he's got real sole power when his brother Ivan dies. Now, when he does become, Tsar and later Emperor, of course, of Russia, Peter does do a few things to try to modernize the state and make reforms to Russia at the time. One of his most famous things that he did at the beginning of his reign was the so-called Grand Embassy of Peter the Great. This is when he traveled to the West to study, what they're doing over there, militarily. He was trying to find out also new knowledge about the West through the Enlightenment. So he did from 1697 to 98. He traveled to multiple countries. They think Peter went to the Netherlands. He went to Poland. He went to Austria. He went to England. I think later he went to France as well. So he traveled all of these different countries in Europe. So he was one of the first Russian leaders to actually leave the state and go visit another country at the time. And so after he came back, if you know about it, he began making all these reforms to his state. I think in the Netherlands, like in Holland, he wanted to know about shipbuilding because, Russia didn't have a navy. And that's one thing that he's going to try to do, of course, which is establish a navy and all that. These are examples of some things that he did to reform Russia. One thing he did that's very, very famous, you may have heard about, was he made all the nobility and all that become more westernized dress, like the way they dress with their clothes, the women, the way they dress. Also, you can see this image right here. He made all the men shave their beards. So you can see he has a mustache, Peter the Great. So probably one of the most famous paintings of him, probably right there. And they made all the men shave. If you wanted to keep your beard, you had to pay a beard tax. It was like a token you had to carry with you. If you didn't have the token and you had a beard, they have to cut your beard off, basically. He did introduce the potato because I think when he went to England, he discovered the potato, and so he brought that back. The only thing was Peter was known for instigating more serfdom. When other countries, like in Europe, 17th, 18th century, were getting rid of serfdom, they increased it instead. So that's one thing that was kind of different. I think over time, I think the Russia has like 30 million or more people that are actually serfs, that are kind of like bound to the land, to like the nobility and to the state and things like that. He also adopted the Julian calendar as well, which is like a leap calendar, but everybody else was going to the Gregorian calendar. And so actually their calendar was off compared to the rest of Europe, which it is up to 1918 when the future Soviet Union will adopt the Gregorian calendar. That'll be a little later. He brought in art, culture, newspapers, things like that to the Russian state. So he's trying to make Russia, more like everybody else in these other modern countries we've kind of talked about as well. Also, he wanted to modernize the military. When he was in the West, he tried to bring back not just superior technology like better muskets and things like that or cannon, but he also brought back military advisors. In fact, one of his most famous advisors was Peter Gordon. He came in from Britain, and he basically was involved in trying to educate his forces on how to fight better battles. And I think by the time of his death, Peter the Great, the Russian army expanded to about 200,000 troops. So it was pretty large in size. Also, 1696, they think that was the year that Peter the Great also founded the Russian Navy as well. That's one thing I did want to talk about, which is important. about Peter the Great. Peter fought a lot during his reign. One of the most important things that he did in his reign was he fought to try to gain a warm seaport, which Russia was actually landlocked before he came in. So he's going to expand Russian territory. One of the first things he did was he seized Azov, which was a famous fortress that was on the Sea of Azov, like in the northern Black Sea region, close to Crimea. He fought in the Great Turkish War. He got Russia to fight in that war, in that Holy Alliance, or Holy League, that was being founded by Leopold I of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. Poland, Lithuania, I think, was in it as well in the Great Turkish War. So Russia was involved in a bunch of battles against the Turks, mostly fighting in the northern Black Sea. And that was one of his most successes, but they really couldn't get into the Black Sea much because the Turks controlled a lot of things like Constantinople in the southern area. So they mostly did control the northern part eventually. The other big war he got into was called the Great Northern War. That was really considered his greatest war he fought in, Peter the Great. That was a conflict where he fought against Sweden, which at the time was really an empire, the Swedish Empire, which controlled part of Scandinavia, northern Poland, and even part of the Baltic states, area close to Russia today. And they were led by this very young king named Charles XII, who at one point invaded Russia in the early 18th century. And this war was kind of an extension of the War of the Spanish Succession that was kind of going on in Europe at the same time. This became one of Russia's first major wars that they really fight in Europe. That's kind of important. Russia was able to use its more modernized armies to defeat Sweden in the war. They also used scorched earth policies against the Swedes, which, Russia's kind of known for up to Napoleon's time and probably up to Hitler's time, during World War II. Their most decisive battle was the Battle of Poltava, which was in 1709. Russia was able to gain territory on the Baltic Sea. And from there, you'll see later afterwards, Peter's going to be able to build his new capital that he wants to build, of course, which is St. Petersburg. And that's the thing that he does later, which I guess is considered one of his most famous, feats. I guess as a ruler, Peter the Great, is the building of St. Petersburg, which becomes, later the capital of Russia between 1712 to 1918. It's the capital of Russia, not Moscow. Moscow is later the capital again when the Soviet Union comes in. Of course, still the capital today. But Peter had this idea to create more of a westernized type city that would be more like London or a Paris or a Vienna. And he called it his so-called window on the West, where he could not just, interact with European powers in the West, but also trade. They could have a warm seaport, especially in the summer, and they could basically trade back and forth, with countries like Britain and other countries in Europe. So this is something that he kind of sees as being important. And so he wanted to design and build a city that looks more like a modernized city in Europe. Of course, I talked about it, how Peter famously built some new palaces, which one of the first palaces that really gets built that you hear about is the so-called Peterhof, which I, of course, showed you a short video, which the Peterhof, is very, very famous for its fountains, which they saw the video are 300 years old this July, this year, 2021. And the Peterhof is a kind of a late Baroque style type palace that Peter the Great had commissioned in the early 1700s. It did have influence from some French architects that kind of were involved in it, in building it, including some of the gardens and parks that went with it. And you can see the fountains, of course, that went with it. And so a lot of people later referred to it as being called the so-called Russian Versailles. It was supposed to be this type of palace that was supposed to be the answer to, I guess, what Louis XIV had built in France and all that. And the name Peterhof, by the way, means Peter's court. It's actually what it means. It's really just Peter off. I don't think they call it palace, but that's basically what it is. It's a collection of palaces that are part of that. And it's also got gardens and parks that are behind it, kind of like all these other palaces have as well. So they built that. Later, so I've got another image right here, I guess I'll share with you, but it does have this canal that kind of runs out to the Gulf of Finland, because the Gulf of Finland is basically where St. Petersburg was actually built. It's kind of an arm of the Baltic Sea, which is right there. But yeah, you can see that right there. Later, he also builds this other famous fortress, which they refer to it as being called the so-called Peter and Paul Fortress, which was a citadel he constructed in St. Petersburg, which was built initially because they thought that the Swedes were going to come back, try to invade Russia again, and reconquer the territory that they had taken from them. But they never came back. I guess they never were able to invade. And it's actually one of the first buildings he built in St. Petersburg was the Peter and Paul Fortress, named after St. Paul and St. Peter in the New Testament. And it wasn't just a fortress. It was actually later used as a political prison by the Czars of Russia. And the Soviet Union later used it as a political prison as well. I think they buried some of the Czars in it early on, but a lot of the later Czars were buried like on the Kremlin grounds in the future. So that's the story, Peter the Great. His rise to fame and all that. Now they do have later czars that come in. They have like Peter does have a son that was supposed to reign, but he actually didn't want to reign, which was kind of a problem. And so what happened later? He had a wife named Catherine. Catherine the First actually was considered one of the first female rulers that they had of Russia, like Tsarina, Empress of Russia. She reigned for a few years. And Peter III was a grandson of Peter, who also reigned a little later. I think later they had some other Ivans that reigned too. I think it was Ivan the Sixth, I think was another Tsar who was well known that didn't reign long. But they had Elizabeth, I'll get to later, Empress Elizabeth as well, who will reign. Who was one of the youngest daughters of Peter the Great. She was really one of the greatest female rulers they had, besides Catherine the Great. And that's who I wanted to kind of move on to for a few minutes today and talk about next, which is Catherine the Great, who also known as Catherine II overall. Catherine the Great is considered one of the greatest female rulers of Russia. She was an enlightened despot that was kind of seen as this type of ruler that was trying to advance the same kind of reforms as Peter the Great was. So she's trying to, westernize Russia to make it a better state, like some of those countries in Europe, at the time. And the interesting thing about Catherine the Great, though, was that she was not really full Russian. I think she was part Russian. She was actually mostly this German princess. Her real name was Sophia Augusta of Anhalt-Zerbst. Her father was like a ruler of those two countries, one called Anhalt, another one called Zerbst. And what happened was she married her second cousin, who was named Charles Peter Ulrich, who was from another German state called Holstein. And he happened to be, by the way, the nephew of Empress Elizabeth of Russia, who was, by the way, the ruler of Russia from 1741 to 1762. She was one of the youngest daughters of Peter the Great. And anyway, they married in 1744, but the two hated each other. They couldn't stand each other, by the way, Peter and Catherine. And so I think there's a theory that they never consummated the marriage or something like that. And anyway, what happened was when Elizabeth died in 1762, Peter became Tsar as Peter III. And Peter III was really unpopular. Now, a lot of people thought he was like crazy or insane. Some people thought he was gay also as well. And so what happened was Catherine got involved in this palace coup with the palace guard. I think the head of the palace guard, I think, was involved as well. And so they basically overthrew Peter. And so she was put in power afterwards. And so after that, when she was, coronated as Empress of Russia, she decided to take the name Katharina, or Catherine. And so after that, she was known as, of course, Catherine the Great, of course, as ruler. And she'll reign, by the way, 1762 to 1796. So you can see she reigned over 30-something years. And during her reign, she would, like I said, try to make reforms to the state. She brought in more art and culture. I'll talk about her most famous feat, she was known for doing, which was the so-called Hermitage Museum. That's probably one of her most famous things that she did. But Catherine was this type of woman that really wanted, even though she was more German, she really wanted to be a Russian. And so she converted from Protestantism to Orthodox Christianity. And she even, like I said, took up a more of a Russian type name, of course, Katharina, instead of, Sophia, basically. Now, one of her most famous things that she's, known for, of course, Catherine the Great, is some of her reforms that she, of course, did later. The big thing she's known for is the Winter Palace, which I'll kind of show a short video on that. Is, of course, one of the most famous palaces that was built in St. Petersburg, which was built by multiple rulers of the Ramanath Dynasty. And in that museum, she basically built a museum out of it, often called the Hermitage or State Hermitage Museum. And it is considered, by the way, one of the largest museums in the world with something like 3-4 million works of art in it. I will show a short video on it, on the Hermitage, which is pretty interesting, all the artwork that's in it.
Russia's State Hermitage is one of the world's greatest art museums, with a collection numbering around 3 million works of art. The superb architectural ensemble of the museum buildings is situated in the very center of St. Petersburg and includes the Winter Palace, the former official residence of the Russian Empress, as well as the buildings of the small, large and new Hermitages and the Hermitage Theatre. The Jordan staircase opens the way to the suite of state rooms in the imperial residence. Grand processions would ascend it on their way to the large throne room. That hall, created in the austere neoclassical style, is striking for the grandeur of its architectural concept. At the far end, the throne of the Russian Empress stands on a raised dais. The small throne room has a commemorative function, being devoted to the memory of Peter the Great, the founder of St. Petersburg. The 1812 War Gallery was conceived by Emperor Alexander I to celebrate Russia's victory over Napoleon. Hanging on its walls are 332 portraits of generals who fought heroically in what became known as the Patriotic War. One of the most striking rooms in the museum is the Pavilion Hall, where the interior decoration combines Renaissance motifs with a Moresque style. A significant place in the museum display in the Winter Palace is occupied by the living apartments of the imperial family, notably the Malachite Room, Golden Drawing Room, and Crimson Boudoir. These authentic interiors have survived down to the present day. The beginnings of the Hermitage's famous art collection were laid in 1764, when Empress Catherine II acquired 225 Western European paintings. That year is considered the date of the museum's foundation, One of the largest sections in the gallery consists of works of Italian art. The Hermitage is justly proud of its masterpieces by Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Titian, and other great names. It is also home to one of the world's finest collections of works by the brilliant 17th century Dutch artist Rembrandt. That includes some of the master's most significant creations. The collection of the great Flemish artist Peter Paul Rubens embraces all the periods of his career. The Hermitage can boast a fine collection of works of Roman art, spanning the period from the 1st century BC to the 4th century AD, and Italian sculpture of the 18th and early 19th centuries. The modern gallery opens with a constellation of brilliant French painters. Art lovers from around the world come to the Hermitage to view its masterpieces by the Impressionists, Monet, Renoir, and Post-Impressionists, Degas, Van Gogh, and Gauguin, and early works by Matisse and the father of Cubism, Pablo Picasso. The State Hermitage has become one of the symbols of St. Petersburg, and today it is simply impossible to imagine cultural life in Russia without this world-famous museum.
A little short little video there, of course, about the State Hermitage Museum, of course, in St. Petersburg. So yeah, all that art, it's amazing the amount of artwork they've got, of course, in that former palace, the Winter Palace, of course, where the Czars originally ruled from. All right, so anyway, yeah, Catherine, like I said, was like famous for our westernization, art and culture. Oh, there is this thing I did want to mention, which is interesting. She did try to reform like education. There was one thing where she actually had schools for girls, which were mostly nobility, I know, noble women. You may have heard of the Smolny Institute that was in St. Petersburg. That was something she was kind of famous for trying to do also during her reign. Now, there was one thing she wanted to do reform-wise, which really never came to fruition much, was she wanted to try and abolish serfdom in the country, which Peter the Great had started to do, and other countries were, starting to get rid of serfdom at the time. However, they had this rebellion break out that was known as, it's got different names, usually called the Puka Chap Revolt, or some people call it the Puka Chap Rebellion, which lasted about almost 2 years in Western Russia, 1733 to 35. And it was led by this Cossack soldier. Cossacks were like soldiers that were like mostly in the Ukraine in Russia. And Emelian Pugachev was his name. He was joined up with like peasants or serfs that wanted their freedom. I think some of the Orthodox Church wanted to make some reforms as well to the state. And so Pugachev declared that he was czar. In fact, he said that he was the former czar, Peter the Third, who had been, I think Peter III was killed, I think, under Catherine. And so the rebellion changed everything. It mostly happened like around Western Russia and the Volga region in eastern Ukraine, mostly. And so it totally changed Russia. I think they seem to think that it prevented really serfdom from really being abolished at that point. And so serfdom will not be abolished in Russia until the 1860s, much, much later, almost 100 years when that happens. Oh, what happened to the revolt? Oh, well, Catherine's armies crushed it. Basically sent his forces in there, and close to 10,000, I think, people were probably killed in the revolt when she put it down. So yeah, she was this reformer or whatever, but obviously a lot of these enlightened despots were pretty much autocrats as well. Pugachev was also captured. He was hanged also for being involved, of course, in that particular revolt. Now, of course, Pugachev on the bottom right there. So he claimed to be Peter the Third pretty much, which obviously wasn't. Now, the thing that Catherine's also known for doing, which is very famous as well, is Catherine's known for her expansionism of Russia, which I did want to talk about. It's probably her greatest success overall. Under her, Russia expanded quite a lot in the west and in the east. Poland, if you know about it, which was originally called Poland, Lithuania, that state kind of collapsed at the end of the 18th century, and it was gobbled up by multiple states. Russia, Prussia, and Austria basically took their territory from them, and Russia got almost 2/3. It's kind of in that brown area in the western part of that map that you're looking at right there. So this area right here is the area that was like part of Poland right here. Also down here, another area that they took over was southern, they kind of colonized southern Ukraine and also took over the Crimea, which is right here, Crimean Peninsula, which was originally controlled by the Ottoman Empire. They seized that from them. They start colonizing that area, and still today in that part of, the Ukraine, I guess now part of the Ukraine now, there's a lot of Russian people that live there. Of course, that area, you can't see it right there, but the Crimea on the bottom, which is, Crimea is like right here. The Crimea is very important, that little peninsula right here, because that's where the Russians, have their Black Sea Fleet, and still do today, of course. I think I've got another picture showing the actual, partition of Poland, which they were involved in, and she basically was involved in, I think, several partitions of Poland, 3 of them. Also, I've got another thing that she was known for as well. She also took over Alaska. Of course, they start colonizing that as well, the Russians. And so part of why the Russians went in Alaska was because of the fur trade, like seals and other animals, polar bears. And so they wanted to go in there to get the fur, of course, from that. So the Russian Empire itself will eventually peak in size. I think the size of it up to I want to say that the 19th century is close to 9 million square miles, or 23 million kilometers in size. That's the size of, how big Russia gets at one point, from basically around Poland, Ukraine, all the way to the Pacific and part of Alaska. They're actually the 3rd largest empire in size, behind really the Mongol Empire, which is considered the 2nd largest, and then British Empire, is the largest empire that there ever was in history. After her death, by the way, Paul would later become the actual czar afterwards, like the Emperor of Russia. Paul was believed to be the son of Catherine the Great and Peter III, but there's been kind of doubts about that. Some claim that it wasn't, and one of Catherine's lovers may have been the actual real father. And of course, he had a grandson later named Alexander I, Emperor Alexander I, who, of course, will defeat Napoleon when he invades Russia, which, the Russians call the Napoleonic Wars, the so-called Patriotic War they fought in. So they'll defeat Napoleon in Russia in 1812, and really the early 19th century was the peak of the Russian Empire, and in late 19th century, the Russian Empire, of course, later declines. There is one story about Catherine that is kind of notorious. They believe Catherine was a nymphomaniac. She had a lot of lovers. I forget the number she had, but she had 21 or 22 lovers at one point in her life. And it was a story that's an urban legend that she died making love to a stallion. I don't know if you heard that story about that. They think it's a made-up story, but they think she kind of was a nymphomaniac. She liked sex a lot, apparently. I think they even had some kind of special cabinet that they found later. It has like sex toys in it or something like that. They found about her. But I think she died of a stroke is what really happened to her. But maybe it was the stallion that killed her. I don't know. But anyway, this is kind of an urban legend. They talk about her. But anyway, but yeah, like I said, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, those two great, czars of Russia are really the greatest rulers they had, really, especially with the Ramanath Dynasty and all that. But I'll talk about more modern Russia later in the 19th century. When I get to the 19th century, I'll kind of talk more about what happens to Russia. They kind of have to go through reforms later, but really they don't do enough. And you'll see later Russia as the Russian Revolution that breaks out. They have two of them actually. But the second one in 1917, led to the Soviet Union forming, where the communists took over, like socialists took over Russia. And Russia's gone through a lot of hard times, as you know, over the years. Their population, has really been in decline because of all these different conflicts they were in. World War I, World War II, of course, the Stalinist purges they had in Russia. And so, yeah, Russia is struggling, but they're still considered, a major power, in the world today. So anyway, before I go, of course, I want to remind you, don't forget that Canvas quiz on the conquest of America. I think that's due tonight. I'll check on that, but I'll send out reminders about it. But that's something you need to kind of wrap up, get that done this week. Of course, I am posting the first exam. Should be already up already, but that's going to be, like I said, on the Age of Absolutism lectures. No other topic will be on there. So you complete the study guide sections, you can just turn that into me for extra credit. And that's it. So anyway, that's it for today. I think next week I'm moving on to talk about the rise of the British Empire. I'll kind of talk about the Tudors and the Stuart dynasties that they have that develop in England. So I'll talk about them a little later. But I'll see y'all, of course, next week. Hope y'all have a good weekend, of course, coming up. But if you have any comments, questions about this lecture, please let me know. Later, you can just leave me comments, questions, or email me about the class if you had an administrative question. If you want to subscribe to my channel, you can also do that, of course, below as well. So y'all take care and have a great weekend coming up. So y'all see y'all later.